Okay, hello ladies. So this was the problem we did, the last problem from the section 4.5 packet, and I just wanted to sort of finish this up completely since you had a similar problem on the quiz. And let me say this, on the quiz you only have to do one full period. I put two, but just do one full period. Okay. So in class we sort of looked here at the amplitude and the period. So we figured out the amplitude is going to be 2 for F, and for G the amplitude is 1, right? Because the amplitude is always positive. And the period, and so you guys need to remember to find the period, you take 2 pi and divide it by your B coefficient, which happens to be, that's sloppy, but those two numbers there, that's your B. So for F, our period is 2 pi over 2, which is pi. And then for G, the period is 2 pi over 4, which is pi over 2. Okay, so that's pi over 2. And I said, well, let's do 4 intervals for each, so a total of 8 intervals then. But in order to do that, you take your period and divide it by 4, or how many intervals you want to have. And so if we do this for this one, we have to be careful since we're graphing two different functions on the same graph. So for this one, we would have, let's see, pi over 4. So each interval needs to be pi over 4 units apart. And here, this would be, so this is in terms, well, let me go back. So this represents the number of intervals. And so again, we take our period and divide it by how many intervals we want. So for G, it would be pi over 8, right? Because that's pi over 2 divided by 4 is pi over 8. And so again, this represents each interval, the spacing on each interval, which this does as well. So since we want to put, what I was saying in class, since we want to put pi over these two functions on the same graph, we need to be mindful of their periods and be mindful of the spacing. So that's why I said in class, the last thing I said in class is that to do that, you always want to look at the smaller number between the two once you break it down into the intervals, and that's going to be pi over 8. So that means we're going to break these intervals into pi over 8. So let's do that now. Okay, so I have gone ahead and wrote the graph out and put our spacings on there and just simplify some things. So let me make a couple of notes again. I want to make sure you guys are clear on something. Let's see. Actually, okay. Take that period. Actually, let me go back. I don't want to do that. Okay. So remember in class, so let's look at the period. I don't want you all to confuse. Okay. So in terms of our F graph, our F function, which is 2 cosine 2x, right? The period is pi. And again, that means in order to complete a full cycle of this cosine function, you only need to go out to pi for this function. But for G, you only need to go out to pi over 2 to complete a full cycle of the cosine function, okay? So here, what I've done is, again, since we want to plot these on the same graph, I wanted 4 intervals for my first graph and 4 for my second. And so that's how I got the pi over 4 than pi over 8. Since pi over 8 is smaller than pi over 4, instead of making if we make each interval pi over 4, we're going to miss some of the pi over 8 points that we want, right? Or sort of intervals that we want. So that's why we picked the smaller interval. Okay. And again, on your quiz, just do one full period. You don't have to do two full entire periods. That's going to be too much. Okay. And so then what I did from there is on the graph. So this is 1 pi over 8, right? 2 pi over 8. And I simplify. So make sure you simplify the fractions. So 2 pi over 8 is the same as pi over 4. 3 pi over 8, 4 pi over 8 is pi over 2, 5 pi over 8, 6 pi over 8 is 3 pi over 4, 7 pi over 8, and then 8 pi over 8 is pi. And so notice again, the period for G is pi over 2, so that means once we get to this point here, our G graph is going to have completed a full cycle from 0 to pi over 2, and then from 0 to pi, our f function will have completed a full cycle of the graph. Okay, so hopefully that makes sense. Now, in terms of these values, I created a table here on the right hand side. You see this table. And so we are going to evaluate these values, right? And so what I'm going to do possibly the first two with you all, and then I'm going to pause the video and I want you guys to figure them out, and then I'll come back to the video. Well, then you'll press play on the video. Okay. So for 0 is pretty straightforward. So for f function, and I'm going to write here because I can erase it. So for f, so f of 0. So you want to write on some scrap sheet of paper because I'm going to erase this. But f of 0 is 2 times cosine of 2 times 0, right? So that's just 2 times cosine of 0. Well, what's cosine of 0? Cosine of 0 is 1, right? So that means f of 0 is going to be 2. All right. And then g of 0 is equal to what? Negative cosine of 4 times 0. Well, that's just going to be negative 1. So g of 0 is negative 1. And we're done with x. We're done when x is equal to 0, right? Let's look at pi over 8. So for f of pi over 8 is going to be equal to 2 times cosine of 2 times pi over 8. Well, that's 2 times cosine of, simplified, that's pi over 4. And so that's 2 times root 2 over 2, or just root 2. All right. And since we're graphing this, you would approximate, and I think root 2 is approximately like 1.4, I believe. You could double check with the calculator. So that's about 1.4. Okay. Oh, I didn't mention too, remember, as well, since the amplitude for f is 2 and 1 for g, that's why our max and our min is going to be 2 and negative 2 on our graph, the output. Okay. All right. And then let's look at g of pi over 8. That's negative cosine of 4 times pi over 8. Simplify that. That's negative cosine of pi over 2. Cosine of pi over 2 is just 0, right? So that's just negative 0 times 0 is just going to be 0. So g of pi over 8 is 0. All right, so pause the video and see if you can figure out the rest of these values, and then press play when you're done. All right, ladies, so you should have completed the table, and I actually drew the picture just to save time because my stylus acts up on my iPad at times. And so I just wanted to save time, and I actually graphed the values. Now, I would suggest, because of how short I made my the negative y-axis, I didn't have room to space out negative 1 and negative 2. I would advise you all to space it out a little further than I did. So you might want to move the x-axis up a little bit so you can extend it down so it can be spaced out a little better. But this is how your graph should look. So notice, because from, what did we say, for our f graph, the period was just pi, well, the period was pi. So it took the entire interval from 0 to pi to draw one cycle of the cosine graph, 2 cosine 2x to be exact. But for our g function, only pi over 2. So from pi over 2 there, and it was negative, which that's what caused it to flip. So it's the cosine function flipped upside down. And we have, because we went out all the way to pi for the g function, we actually have completed 2 periods for the g function. For the f function, and 1 period was just pi, but we completed 2 periods for the g function. Okay. And here's another picture just to give you a little more, I guess, a little more accurate picture. This is my picture that I hand drew. And so I just wanted you to see it a little better than the one I did with the stylus. Okay. All right. So you should be able to complete your quiz now. See you all on Monday.